What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 12 of On Your Guard. Today we're going to be talking about post-processing, my personal workflow. Obviously we don't have a guest today, it's just going to be me. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments section. That's automatically going to enter you to win the Havana 41 BL bag. Real quick, we're going to roll a video to show you what it's all about, and check it out.
Shoot in style with Havana bags by Vanguard. Havana was designed for photographers who like to show a bit of personality with their camera bag. At the same time, Havana doesn't look like a typical camera bag, so you and your expensive gear won't be flagged. Havana backpacks and shoulder bags are offered in either khaki or blue, and come in a variety of sizes. The bags offer exceptional protection with their well-padded camera inserts and dividers. Or you can take these out to make them your everyday carry-all. As always, visit vanguardworld.com for specific dimensions and specs. Make a statement with your camera bag with Havana by Vanguard.
All right, so that's all you got to do. Just like or comment. You'll be entered to win the 41 BL bag. It's blue. It's awesome. I use it myself. So back to the show. Today, again, post-processing, my workflow. I started in Adobe Photoshop about 2004 or 5, so I've been working in it in a long time. A lot of people always ask me, hey, what are your presets? What can you show us? Like, give us some of your presets so we can see how you work. And I don't actually use Lightroom. So, yeah, it's interesting. I actually started before Lightroom existed. So I don't use Lightroom. I do a little bit, that's a topic for another show, but I do use Lightroom Mobile when I'm out and on the go, but really only because it backs up my photos. Again, that's not really what we're going to focus on today. Today, I'm going to be working primarily in Adobe Camera Raw and Adobe Photoshop and kind of working you through how I think about things, the stages of my post-processing, and from Camera Raw to the final output on my phone, usually for Instagram or some sort of social media. Yeah, so that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. It's a little, like, if you've never looked at Photoshop before, it can be a little daunting, but I feel like I'm going to explain it in a way that everyone can understand. And also you have this video to come back to if if you don't really grasp a certain subject while I'm talking about it. So with that being said, we're going to jump in here and kind of walk through some photos. All right, so just to explain a little bit, I'm in Adobe Bridge right now. It's basically a file viewer. It's kind of like the Lightroom gallery, I guess, is the best way to put it. The reason I didn't like Lightroom from the get-go is because I don't like the idea of a catalog. I've kind of gotten used to it, but the catalog always kind of freaked me out a little bit. I like being able to import my photos to a particular location on an external drive or whatever, and just load them up in this. This is all it is a file viewer that has some sorting and tagging features. And I just import my photos to here to a file location on a hard drive and just start working. So that's pretty much it. I guess the easiest way to explain it is I'm using this functionality as my gallery, and then I open things in Camera Raw, and this is basically the Lightroom develop pane. So for those of you who are used to working in Lightroom, you can kind of follow along in the same way. It's just going to be laid out a little different. So everything that I'm talking about you can do, it's just going to look a little different for you. So first off, we're going to talk about color. Color's big for me in my work, and it's something that I really started getting into a few years back. One of the things that kind of became apparent to me when I started shooting with Fujifilm cameras is they have these awesome film simulation modes. Fuji shooters, you are going to know what I'm talking about. Other people, you're missing out. Basically, Fujifilm developed a lot of these cool, they're almost like kind of presets. They're color profiles that kind of are emulated on older films that Fujifilm has created. So from the get-go, like I have access to all of these film simulation modes. Canon and Nikon shooters, you're just going to see your typical like camera neutral, camera portrait. Like they're kind of presets for what you do here. So you're not going to get to have a lot of the fun. My favorite has always been classic chrome, and you can see right away how it darkens the photo. It takes the blues and it makes the blues a little bit teal. It takes the oranges and makes them a little more red. And just flip back and forth between it there for a second. That's kind of what got me into the idea of color science from the get-go, and then it just kind of took off from there for me. So let's dive in here. The first thing I always do when I edit a photo is I look at the color. Fujifilm has an amazing auto white balance, and typically I'm shooting an auto white balance. Auto in Lightroom always makes it too warm for me, so I usually just kind of leave that alone unless there's some visible weirdness going on. And then I just hit auto, just see what I'm working with here, see what kind of dynamic range the shot has and color and everything. Obviously that's way too bright for me. I like things dark and moody, so I'm going to start dialing back, get it kind of to a baseline of what I like. One of the biggest things for me is I always went heavy on the contrast slider when I first started editing photos, and that's not how I do it now. Used to be I would crank up the contrast and then pull up the shadows, but the problem I have with the contrast slider is not only is it creating contrast in the luminance range, so like the tonality of the photo, but it's also making colors more saturated, and I don't really like that as much. So my workflow now, I actually come back on the contrast slider and then I take the blacks down because that helps me achieve that dark to light contrast. And you can see it's not really, I mean it is a little bit, but it's not as apparent that it's killing the colors of the photo. So I'm just I think I'll leave it right there. I also like bringing the highlights down. This photo doesn't have a ton of high dynamic range, so I have a lot to work with. But this is kind of what I'm looking at as a standard. Contrast down, highlights are down, shadows are up, and then I'm going to bring my whites up to kind of battle the highlights being down a little bit. And then I always use the clarity just kind of as needed in these sort of areas. I don't think I've ever gone more than 20, so it's somewhere in between 10 and 20. The key to when I'm post-processing is I always want subtlety. And a lot of times, like, you can overdo something, like crank stuff way down, and you can see, you can just tell, like, you start getting halos around the edges when you bump up the contrast, and it just starts looking nasty. That's a great way to start. Like, I always try to tell people, experiment when you're first learning these programs and figure out what you like, and then you kind of see along the way, maybe I shouldn't do that, or maybe I should dial back a little bit here or there. I'm gonna undo what I just did there real quick. So I'm going to go maybe around 15, 17. Okay, leave that alone. Next up is curves. Curves are pretty daunting to people because it's this, I mean, what do you do with this, you know? But it's kind of easy to understand. I actually have some curves presets that I've saved here that are my go-to. So usually what you'll see in this panel is just a medium contrast, strong contrast, or linear, medium, strong, and custom. I have some extras there from stuff that I've used in the past. But you can see here when you do a medium or a strong, it's basically just, I know some of you have probably heard of the S-curve before. It's kind of basic post-processing. But it's just given an S-curve. It's bringing the darks down and it's bringing the highlights that creates extra contrast within your scene. And that was my introduction to curves. And then I started looking, actually under this, you can mess with the curves of the individual color channels as well. So what I came to realize is not only can you give your luminance values, that original RGB, you can give that a curve, but you can also give the colors a curves too, or give it a curve too. And what ends up happening is for the red, when you go down, it's going to introduce blues and greens, and when you go up, so you can actually achieve like a two-tone effect here by just giving this an S-curve. Now, what I ended up finding out, if you give all the colors a similar S-curve, you get some really interesting contrast introduced across the range, from luminance and in the colors. So I have these Bryan's Fave Minus and Bryan's Fave Plus that kind of gives it a bump. You'll see here, from there to here, it starts to pop a lot more. And what I've done is, here it's not as much an S-curve. I'm kind of bringing up the darks a little bit and then bringing down the highlights. What I like to do in Camera Raw a lot of the time is export to Photoshop something that's flat, like that I have a lot of range to work with, because there's a lot of techniques in Photoshop that I like to do. That's one kind of process that I use. Sometimes if I'm in a hurry, or if, like this photo for instance, doesn't really need a whole lot of Photoshop. It's a really great photo. There's not a lot of high dynamic range. I don't need to merge exposures or anything. So this one I could do everything that I need to do right in Camera Raw. And this one is basically the same thing. It's just a little more, I've crushed these blacks a little more, so you get a little more fading in here. And I really like what that does to the tonality and the colors of the photo. But what I was saying is, you can see here I've introduced an S-curve to the red channel, I've introduced an S-curve to the green channel, and I've introduced an S-curve to the blue channel. And what that does is it creates contrast within those color ranges, and since they're all still matching, it's not taking it super green or super blue. It's just kind of balancing everything and just introducing some more contrast throughout the range. So these two are kind of what I use, I would say 95% of the time, and then as my curves, and then sometimes it takes a little fine tuning depending on the coloring of the photo. And here is, you'll have all this. This in Lightroom I think is called the HSL panel. Basically you have control over the color tonalities in your photo. I don't like greens at all in my photos, so typically these two are cranked up. You can see it got rid of the greens and turns them a little more red. Just a personal preference thing. More naturalist photographers aren't going to do this, but I'm more of a fine art kind of person, and I like to put my spin on things. So that's something that I tend to do. Saturation, this one I would definitely bring the blues down a little bit, and then maybe even bring the luminance down a little bit. What these sliders do is they're taking that color range and they're kind of shifting the luminance values of that color range. So you can see up here in the clouds, I'm bringing more texture and detail into the clouds, about maybe right there. And you can do this throughout the photo. If I wanted to make the trees in the foreground pop a little more, I can pull these values up a little bit, and even the reds, because there's some reds in there too. That's pretty much. I don't really mess with split toning. I'm just going to run through the rest of the panels here. I don't really mess with lens corrections. Fujifilm's profiles are all, for their lenses, are all built into Lightroom, so they're auto-applied. For Canon and stuff, you people will probably want to enable profile corrections, which is going to identify what lens you're using, and it's going to get rid of vignetting and stuff like that the lens creates. Always remove chromatic aberration. And sometimes, if this photo, you could mess with the dehaze. Dehaze is kind of something, within the past couple years that Adobe introduced, it's really for like, you can get rid of fog and you can introduce some crazy contrast into a photo. You can see up here, I'm liking this result, but I don't like what's going on down here. So I'm going to dial this back. I don't use this a whole lot, but every now and then I'll mess around. Really, every photo is different. I don't have one specific technique. I'm a big proponent of understanding the tools that you have. That way, when you have a photo that you want to work on, you know, okay, well, maybe I can try this, or maybe this one's a little weird this way, I'll try using this technique. And back to this camera calibration and profile panel, here is usually where I would start with a photo. I have these beautiful film simulation modes to use, and so I would usually pick a film simulation mode and then go from there. Provia and Classic Chrome are usually the ones that I go with the most, and see how it's kicking the contrast up, or the saturation up quite a bit on this particular photo. And what I can do to combat that is go back here and bring the blues back down. Maybe the reds down too, they're kind of popping a little much. Okay. So anyway, I was just introducing you to kind of all of the tools. I do deal a lot in this camera profile panel. It's a little weird, and I don't quite know how to explain it other than you're kind of messing with the hue and saturation of tonal ranges, but you can do a lot of cool things within this, and even without fully grasping what it does, you can just kind of play around and see. I kind of like this two-tone of red to teal that it's given here. So, I mean, it's just something that you can jump in and mess with. You know, take the saturation down on this just to see what kind of result you can get. So, I mean, huge proponent of just going in and messing around and kind of finding a style. This photo, and originally when I edited it, it was very, very saturated, and I'm just trying to do something a little different now just to see how it goes. Oh, we have a question.
Yeah, once you, this is from Nathaniel. Once you edit your photos, where do you send for printing?
Oh, that's a great question. So I print a ton at home. I have a really nice Canon Pixma, I think it's a Pixma Pro 10 printer that I bought that prints up to 13 by 19. So I do a lot of printing at home, and that way I just have more control. For clients, when I print, I usually outsource to WHCC.com. They're one of the better printing houses. I think they're based out of Minneapolis, maybe? I think it's in Minnesota. But they have like free 2-day FedEx shipping to you and everything, and they have a whole slew of options. Yeah, printing's a whole different thing. I feel like we could have a whole other show on printing, because people should be printing their work, and it's a lot easier than it sounds. But today's world's so kind of social, and everybody's posting to Flickr or Facebook or Instagram or 500px, and so you're kind of toning and doing things for the web. I have a completely different process when it comes to printing.
Want to do a commercial?
Let's do a commercial.
All right, tell them what we're going to win.
Yeah, so again, this bag is what we're giving away today. We're actually giving away two. We're going to give one away at the end of the broadcast, and then we're going to give another one away at the end of the weekend. All you have to do is comment on this Facebook Live to be entered to win, and we're going to choose someone at random.
Shoot in style with Havana bags by Vanguard. Havana was designed for photographers who like to show a bit of personality with their camera bag. At the same time, Havana doesn't look like a typical camera bag, so you and your expensive gear won't be flagged. Havana backpacks and shoulder bags are offered in either khaki or blue, and come in a variety of sizes. The bags offer exceptional protection with their well-padded camera inserts and dividers. Or you can take these out to make them your everyday carry-all. As always, visit VanguardWorld.com for specific dimensions and specs. Make a statement with your camera bag with Havana by Vanguard.
All right, welcome back. So we're going to jump back into this. Again, like, comment, share this post to be entered to win the bag. We're giving away two. Jumping back in here. So we have a lot to get to today. I kind of outlined with the first photo the tools that you have available and the tools that I use on the regular, and we're just going to kind of go from there and jump around here, show you some of my favorite techniques. A lot of this stuff is just super in-depth, and there's no way without going like an hour or 2 hours, we're going to get to it all, but we are definitely planning to do more of these kinds of episodes. So chime in the comments. You know, if something isn't explained or if you want something explained, please, you know, ask us and you drop us a comment or a message or whatever, and outline what you want to learn from us. So here's a good example of another tool that I love and that everybody should be using. This is in Lightroom as well, but you have the transform palette, and everybody should be doing this in my opinion. You have perspective corrections. You can see this photo is horribly, I mean, it's just off balance. It's definitely, the horizon line isn't straight. I typically shoot in camera. I have a nice electronic level that shows me when I'm, you know, perfectly level. But I was actually shooting this photo. I was holding the camera super close to the ground, and I wasn't able to get the best viewpoint of what I was shooting. And I didn't have a very long time to shoot these this family of geese. So luckily with Camera Raw, I can adjust that with the click of a button. And typically what I would do is go in here and crop just like this, and you can go under here and constrain to image so that you get rid of this little bit right here. But what I like to do is Photoshop has some nice tools where I'm going to set that as the crop, and I'm actually going to open this image in Photoshop real quick and show you an easy way of filling in that blank space. Again, just knowing the tools that you have and what you can do is amazing. Oh, another thing that I would love to talk about while Photoshop is opening my image here is just computer and processing. If you're going to get into a lot of post-processing in Photoshop, you're going to want a decent computer. In my experience, Macs are just better at handling processor power and this kind of stuff. Adobe products just work better on a Mac than they do on a PC. That being said, you can do it on a PC. I just don't have the patience for it. So what I'm going to do here to get rid of this is I'm going to grab this tool called the polygonal lasso tool, and I'm actually just going to draw a little selection here where there is transparency and connect it down here. So it's selected that area, and I'm just going to hit Shift and Delete on a Mac, and you have these fill options, and I'm going to say content aware fill and OK, and give that a second to process, and boom.
Goes the dynamite.
Boom goes the dynamite. I filled in that space. Photoshop does an amazing job of, you know, checking out the pixels that are there, and it's in an out of focus area, so it's going to be a lot easier than if I was trying to replace something where the main subject of the photo is. But rather than cropping in on the image and losing some resolution, I was able to maintain that little bit extra resolution and get the perspective that I really wanted. So Content Aware tool is awesome. You can use it in Photoshop many different ways. We'll get to that maybe in a later episode more in depth, but you can also search these tutorials online on YouTube, and yeah. So let's get back to Lightroom here real quick. I want to show you a couple other Lightroom, Camera Raw real quick. I want to show you a couple other my favorite features that are baked into Camera Raw and Lightroom again. So this is a panorama I shot in Chicago when it was freezing cold. And what you end up having is a ton of these photos. You can tell like they're not straight. I don't think I had a tripod, so was I working? No, I think I was on a tripod. But you can tell like the horizon line isn't straight. It's just kind of crappy, but basically I want to make these into a panorama. Used to be you had to import everything into Photoshop, but now Lightroom and Camera Raw have this amazing feature where I'm just going to select all of those photos, click this little menu button and say merge to panorama, and it's going to, you know, merge it all. We don't have time to wait. I've already merged it. So what it's going to do is it's going to create actually a raw file, a DING file, which is an Adobe Camera Raw file with all of those merged, and you can tell you can set it to where it auto crops your photo. I wanted that extra space because, again, maybe I want the extra resolution where I import this into Photoshop and Content Aware and fill in. But I wanted to show you just how awesome this is. I'm going to set these to Camera Raw defaults here. So this is just after merging, this is what I get. And then it used to be you had to pre-process your photos, each individual photo, import those into Photoshop, and then in Photoshop you merged to a panorama and worked from there. But with the latest couple iterations of Adobe Creative Cloud, they've actually given you the option of building a panorama directly in Camera Raw, and you can see down here I have this is a 50 megapixel file, and just a ton of resolution to work with, seamlessly stacked together, and I can edit it just like it's a raw photo. Again, this is going to be huge in size, but I have the flexibility to now see the entire file, you know, as it's going to be as I'm editing it. So just, it's awesome, and it's really easy, and just a lot of people don't know about these features. Again, that's kind of close to where I would have it. The thing I love about this photo is I have these pinks that kind of look like it's from a sunrise, but the sunrise was happening over here. This is just glow off of the city. So you get this crazy cool color palette. It's just beautiful. Again, I would do this to straighten the horizon line, and yeah, always do that. So I'm going to cancel out of that. So in that same vein...
Wait, this is important.
What?
Christopher wants to know what kind of pizza goes best with editing.
Any pizza goes good with editing. Are you kidding me?
Okay, carry on.
Yeah, pizza. Pizza's pizza. You don't need a specific kind. Goodness. Shame on you for asking. So, kind of along that same vein, I opened up multiple files. This is something I shot this past weekend. You can see this scene has a lot of dynamic range. You have, even this shot. This shot was 2 stops underexposed, and I still have a very, very bright area here, which I can save with highlights. But one of the things that I like doing is merging all of these to an HDR. Now, HDR, as most people know it, kind of stinks. It's bad. People do it horribly, but we want to do it more natural. Same way you can merge to a panorama, you can select all of these raw files and merge to an HDR. Again, we're not going to wait. I already have merged this. And what you get is an Adobe RAW file, a DING file, and it is basically what I call a super RAW file at this point, because you have all of the dynamic range from all 3 files baked into one. So you have a lot to work with. When it first processes and comes out, it's automatically going to take the highlights all the way down and the shadows all the way up to kind of give you, here's what like your standard HDR photo is going to look like. Just super, just blown out, not blown out, but just overdone. Something in my work that I always like to introduce is just realism and subtlety. So what I'm going for is I want to bring back some of these shadows, but maintain the texture that you see in here and go from there. So one of the benefits, another benefit to this process is you end up with, like I said, 3 raw files baked into one. When you pull up the shadows, rather than pulling up the shadows like you would, from a single raw file, which can start introducing noise, this is actually pulling in the shadows from the overexposed file where they aren't shadows. So you end up with a file that has so much less noise, it's much cleaner, and the nice thing is that when it's stacking, I shot this one on a tripod, but when it's stacking the files, it actually auto aligns things too. So you can shoot, I have done this while shooting handheld before. I don't recommend it. I always recommend on a tripod because it can, even when you auto align things, when you're shooting with a wide angle like I was, even the slightest movement can kind of shift the perspective and it just doesn't end up matching up. So what I'm going to show you real quick is what you're missing out by not shooting Fujifilm cameras, because that right there, going from just nasty greens, again I hate the color green, to much easier and nicer to deal with. It takes these shadow areas to pretty natural, and I'm still even going to take these greens over a little bit more yellow because I just don't like the color. And then I'm going to add this one because I don't want to crush the blacks in here, and get it to a decent point. Take the contrast down and bring the blacks down a little bit. All right. That's pretty close to what I would do. I might even go a hair darker overall, just because I love this area and I love the brightness that you get, so even if it's a little overexposed. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this in Photoshop, and I want to get a little bit more, get out of Camera Raw for a minute and into Photoshop. Most people know of the plugin called Nik, the Nik collection. It's actually owned by Google now, and it's free, so I would Google the Nik collection. Just Google Nik collection and Google Nik collection Google actually, and download it for free. You end up with these amazing tools here. I usually use color effects and silver effects the most. Color effects, as the title suggests, lets you play with colors, and silver effects lets you play in black and white, but their black and white processing is phenomenal. So I'm going to show you real quick some of the things that you can do in Color Effects because it's a free plugin that everybody should use, if you ask me. Here's kind of the panel that you get, and I have favorited a lot of the color or the presets that I use. But basically what you have, my favorite is Pro Contrast, because you can introduce some contrast and get rid of some of these black areas and introduce some texture back into it with the one slider. Like again, you go full out, that's more like traditional HDR, but even this doesn't look as bad as, like, you know, the old school method of HDR used to look. So I'm going to go here, maybe. Don't need to correct the contrast. I'm going to add a filter. The next thing I like to use is the detail extractor. So what this is going to do, let me see if I can make this panel a little bigger for you and then zoom in. So what this is going to do is really bump those detail areas. Let me zoom in a little bit too. So it ends up kind of overkill. Here's without and here's with. Flip it on. So you see it really brings out a lot of these detail areas that you don't see, which is great, but again, kind of treading into traditional HDR territory, I use this control point and I turn the overall opacity of the effect down to like something around 10 or 15%, just so it's more subtle. Go ahead, we have a question.
Leanne wants to know, did you do any adjustments, auto or other, to any of the raw files before merging?
No, and actually, I've never tried to do adjustments. It used to be, I believe, that it would take your adjustments into account when it merged, so it could kind of mess things up. But what I would do is take your 3 files, if you have processed any of them, open them up and just reset them to default before you merge them into an HDR, just to be on the safe side.
How do you feel about calzones?
Calzone is like a pizza blanket. It's amazing. Everything about it. All right. So back to this. Again, detail, here let me show you a quick with and without. It's just really, this is the area that I'm trying to bring out a little bit more. A lot of people, when they ask me about my work, they're like, you have that dark contrast, but you don't lose the dark areas. So I want those shadows. I'm not afraid of shadows. I don't want to get rid of my shadows completely, but my goal is always to have those natural shadowy areas, but maintain the texture in those areas. So this is kind of a lot of the way that I do it. The last thing that I might do here is just play with these bi-color filters. I might not. Sometimes for sunsets and stuff, these are my favorite filters. And then obviously take the opacity way down. Yeah, it's not going to work for this. Turns things a little too red, so I'm just going to get rid of that. And I'm going to hit OK. And it is going to create a new layer over top of the other layer, which is something else I would like to get into, because masking in Photoshop is your best friend. Again, it's another thing that seems like it's daunting, but it's really not. It's super easy to understand. It's super easy to do. I also highly recommend using a Wacom tablet. I am using the Intuos Pro Medium. I use a Wacom tablet for every computer that I own. It just makes things so much easier. You can really get in, and when I talk about masking here, you're going to see why. So even on its own, this is fine. Like, I like the results, but say in a particular photo, the results, I only want to pertain to the shadow areas. What I can do is I can go down here to this little mask button, and I'm going to click it, and it's going to add a layer mask. So a layer mask is basically, like it says, if it's white, you're going to be able to see everything on this layer. If I invert it, you're not seeing. So like the layer's still on, it's basically invisible. So what I can do then is I can take white and the brush, let's go a little bigger, and I can paint white on that mask, and it's only going to reveal in that white area. Give it a second. Again, I sacrificed power for portability for this MacBook Pro. So I like the 13-inch, and Apple doesn't make a quad-core processor in a 13-inch size, so sometimes I have to wait for certain things. But you can see here, I'll show you the mask real quick. That is what I painted, basically just a blob. But what is happening is this layer that the mask is on, the white is showing and the black is not. So if you turn it back off, so you can see it's only affecting that white area right here. You can do the same thing in the inverse. There's a lot of things that we're going to get into in future tutorials talking about luminance masking, which is an awesome technique. It's probably more than we have time for today. But basically, yeah, this is an easy way to, you can do this, have the same, I painted in shadows here, but you can do the same thing with highlights. If you have a really high dynamic range scene, you can take the highlights and mask them. I don't think I have a good one to show you for that. But let's get into something else here real quick. So here's a good example of something else you can do in Photoshop. So I have these two images that I shot. There's two long exposures. They're the only two shots that I could get with the clouds how they were. You can see back here there's just a storm coming. After I took these shots that were 120 seconds and 60 seconds, it was completely dark. The sky just went completely dark. So these are the only two shots I could get. I love this. I love, the reason I do long exposures like this when there's cloud movement is to show these streaks, get little, sky pops. But this area over here, even if I take the highlights down, I don't like the streaks in this shot as much as the streaks in this shot. I just like it just looks like movement, whereas this is just kind of texture. So what I did was I ended up processing these two photos. Again, I shot them on a tripod, Vanguard Ultra Pro 264 CT, and yeah, and then I took both of these and just opened images in Photoshop, which I have here, so we don't have to wait for it to load. We'll have to wait for this to load, but basically, I'm going to take these two shots, I processed them in the exact same way, and I'm going to drag one as a layer on top of the other. The one with the little portion of the sky that I liked is going to be the top layer. And I'm going to mask out everything but that little cloud section. I'm going to show you what that does. So close. Okay. So here's the two files. Here's one after processing, and here's the other. And again, I like this area in this shot, and I like this area in this shot. So what I did was I just painted a mask like that. And what happens is you get the clouds from one shot into the other. Again, I don't really look at this. Some people are against photoshopping because you're changing what you actually saw, but I actually took both of these photographs. They're minutes apart from each other, and I just made an artistic decision that I wanted it to look a certain way. So super easy. What I ended up on this shot, after you can see many layers of here to color to black and white, here's the color effects that I did to it, to some luminance masking and curves, to more color, to sharpening, to more color, to my final black and white output. So I went from here to here. And this layer, all I did was use that Silver Effects Pro that I was talking about earlier. Super easy. We have another question.
Quick question from Avril. The Fuji settings you're talking about, is it available on all versions of Lightroom or only CC? Also, is it necessary to get the tablet?
Not necessary to get the tablet. It's just if you're planning on doing a lot of masking and this is more natural than this. Like, it just is. We all grew up writing, so this is just much easier to manipulate, and it kind of lets you get a lot more detailed. Definitely not necessary, but like I said, I have the small version of this that is like this big, and it costs $89, I think. The biggest reason that I love these is not only does it function as a tablet, but it has touch. So this is a giant trackpad. I can use it like it's a trackpad as well. So I kind of go between zooming in and out of my images to scrolling around to painting, and it just makes things a lot more fluid when you're editing. The Fujifilm settings, the film simulations are available throughout. Like a lot of people think they have to shoot JPEGs in camera in order to apply the film simulations, but depending on what camera you have, all the Fujifilm cameras have them, but it was the X-T1, I believe, where they introduced Classic Chrome. So I have a shot here, right here. Let me open up this shot real quick. This shot was shot with an X Pro 2, so it's the very first interchangeable, or an X Pro 1, I'm sorry, shot with the very first interchangeable lens camera Fujifilm made. Under the camera profile, I still have film simulations. They're slightly different because they're the original. They tweaked them for the new processor, or the new sensor in the new cameras, but I don't have Classic Chrome here. So the film simulations that you have available in your camera are the ones that are going to be available in Camera Raw for you too. And it should be in, if you're, here's where it gets a little tricky. With Adobe CC, they update Camera Raw with new cameras that are available. I'm not sure which versions of Photoshop support which cameras. So it may be that if you can't edit the raw photos from your camera, you would need to upgrade to a new version of the software. Let's make this our last photo. I'm not sure where we are on time, but I feel like I'm going long today. I like this photo because it's terrible. Nice. I like this photo because it is a terrible, terrible photo. I took this in Italy, and this was the last day we were there. I had been wanting to shoot this tunnel since we arrived, and it always has people in it. So I got this terrible, terrible photo, and I was like, man, I wanted that symmetry, and I wanted the layering, and it's just awful. And so I got to messing around with it, and I found this crop, which actually gets rid of all the people and still kind of maintains that. But you can see it's super blown out. Now, amazingly enough, with the Fujifilm sensor, I can bring those highlights down. And hold on, let me get my magnifying tool. And you can see I got to rescue. So this is another advantage to shooting raw. Had this been a JPEG and I brought these tones down, they would have stayed white as white can be. But with Camera Raw, you're actually capturing all of the information that's present, and it allows you to fix it in post. This is a super extreme example of me being a terrible photographer, but with Camera Raw, I was able to save the shot, and actually, I'm not going to go through what I did to it too much. I'm just going to save. Here's kind of a snapshot. You can save different phases of your photo as a snapshot. So if you get it to a certain point and decide you want to take it further, you can just save a new snapshot and revert back to it. It's pretty cool. But here, we'll just run through. I did Provia. You can see I messed with these settings to get the colors a little bit. I have my Bryan's Fave Minus. I messed a little bit with the hues because I wanted... This was actually very yellow, but coming out of the camera, it was a little... I just was trying to make it more natural, so I was bringing some of that yellow back. Messed a little bit with the saturation of the tonality, or saturation and tonality of the image, and got it to somewhere like this. And then this I can take into Photoshop and turn into something really awesome. One of the things that caught my eye about this from the beginning, I'm going to duplicate the layer here real quick and rasterize the smart object. Yeah. So I'm going to throw that into, just because I talked about it, throw this into Silver Effects and show you one of my favorite techniques. So with Silver Effects, I have a few favorites as well. There's this push process, and you can see it really, I mean, it makes it black and white, but even from a standard, let me turn it to the standard black and white, it's like, it gives it a lot of mood and contrast, and I love this texture, and there's a lot of texture here that I want to bring out. So these are just all different kinds of adjustments for contrast, and get somewhere around there. And you can mess with these settings. This structure is cool. It's kind of like the clarity slider in Camera Raw. It's going to bring out those fine textures. So something like this is going to be just way overdone and HDR-ish, but you can go a little more natural. And then you can even take the structure and isolate. Here's the only structure in the highlights, which I like because it's bringing out the texture in this area. And then I can just do texture in the shadows and the midtones, which is hitting here and here. And just quickly, I'm going to get rid of the grain because I don't like any grain in the shot. I'm going to go ahead and save that, just hit OK, and it's going to create a new layer. But here's the technique. Now, this looks great in black and white, but I'm a color guy primarily, so I'm going to take this and set the black and white layer to overlay and turn this down to around 20 or 30%. And you can see you get all that contrast and all the structure that I pulled in with these fine details, but it retains its color. So that's something that I like to do a lot, is overlay a black and white. You can even do it with luminosity. That's going to do less mood and more just taking the tonality of the image. I like this because it messes with the colors a little bit too and makes it a little darker and moodier. So that would be somewhere close to what my final output would be. So yeah, that's just a little bit. I have so much more of this information to share, and we're going to plan more of these episodes in the future. So please chime in the comments. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't like. I know I just vomited tons of information at you. You can go back and you can watch it as many times until you grasp it, or you can ask us a question. Tell us what else you would like to see, and yeah, we'll be back for more in a couple weeks. Thanks for watching.
We're international! We're international now! That was awesome!
I can't believe I spent friggin' 18 minutes on one damn image.